Our speaker today, Rabbi Brant Rosen, is the spiritual leader of the Jewish Reconstructionist Congregation, the JRC, in Evanston. He has held this role since 1998. He's a graduate of UCLA and the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and is a past president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association and currently serves as the co-chairperson of the Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council. Under the rabbi's guidance, the JRC built its new synagogue in 2008 with an environmentally sustainable design, winning in the process the first platinum rating ever awarded to a house of worship by the U.S. Green Building Council. Rabbi Rosen is a longtime activist for peace, social justice, and human rights, having traveled on delegations to such countries as the former Soviet Union, Nigeria, Rwanda, Uganda, and Iran. His writings appear regularly in his two blogs, and he has contributed to such media outlets as the Chicago Tribune, Huffington Post, and the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And the way that the rabbi came to the attention of our program committee was through one of our longtime and stalwart members, Marilee Cole, who is a member of the JRC. Unfortunately, Marilee had a family commitment or some sort of a personal commitment today, and she couldn't be here, but she wrote these remarks that she asked me to read. So Marilee says, many of you know that the ethical culture movement of which the society is a part was founded in the late 1800s by Felix Adler, a rabbinical student and a son of a well-known rabbi, who wanted to found a movement focused on universal ethics and deed over creed. Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan founded the Reconstructionist Judaism, of which the JRC is a member. And he took philosophy classes from Felix Adler at Columbia College in 1900 and created a tradition, Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, created a traditional but more expansive and humanistic Judaism. And Marilee says, as a member of both these communities, it delights me that these leaders knew and influenced each other. I am pleased to introduce Rabbi Brant Rosen from the JRC, my rabbi, to my ethical humanist community here. It seems to me that he is philosophically linked to both Felix Adler and Mordecai Kaplan as a leader who is connected to the past, but with a forward-thinking vision, a rabbi with great moral courage, and a man whose bottom line is commitment to universal justice. I know you will be moved by hearing about his personal journey to Palestinian solidarity. Welcome.
Marilee, wherever you are. Thank you, Matt, so much for having me. Can people hear me, or should I use the microphone? I'll use the microphone. And can people see me? I prefer to be... Okay. A little bit closer. It's on. Okay. Well, I really do appreciate Marilee and Matt's reaching out to me to speak to you this morning. I think that it makes a great deal of sense in so many ways for the Reconstructionists and the ethical humanists to find ways to dialogue and possibly even to work together. I was chatting with Svetlana earlier, and we were just talking about the issue of sectarianism and in our culture and in our country and in our world, and too often we focus intellectually on what separates us, and which is how denominations and movements get formed. But really, especially in the liberal, rational thinking world that we all occupy, we have so much more in common. And I think certainly in the area of working together in activism and creating a better and more peaceful and more just world, I think there's all kinds of opportunities for us to explore collaboration. So hopefully this will be the beginning of some kind of future together where we could explore what those things might be. And I know that I've already received one inquiry this morning about Reconstructionism, and to learn a little bit more about Reconstructionism. That could easily be a future presentation. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit about that during our conversation if people are interested. But I'm really here to hawk my book, actually. No, I'm here to to talk about a specific issue, which I've written about in this book, and that is easily the most painful, difficult, and potentially incendiary issue in the Jewish community, certainly, of which I'm a part, and that is the Israel-Palestine. And I will start by saying it's really, I'm going to talk about it not academically or geopolitically, although my ideas and my opinions will obviously be part of my conversation to you, but I'm really speaking personally. I'm really speaking about my own personal evolution and journey on this particular issue, which has been a major part of my own Jewish identity for my entire life. And I'm very interested in having a conversation with you. The book really is a conversation. It includes my blog writings and many, many comments to them over a 2-year period. And I'm interested, and certainly I'm interested in speaking to you and sharing with you my thoughts and experiences, but I'm equally as interested in having this be a conversation. I don't purport to speak for the entire Jewish community, needless to say, and I certainly don't purport to speak for my own congregation on this issue. We have a spectrum of points of view on Israel-Palestine, as you might expect. But on the other hand, I am very blessed to be part of a congregation that is willing to countenance a rabbi who speaks out very pointedly and in some ways very painfully for many of my members of my congregation on this issue. And even if they don't agree with everything I say or do, or even if some of the things I say or do they find upsetting, they really have respected my right to, as a clergy person, to speak my conscience. And I'm very indebted to them. I have many rabbi friends who believe similarly to me, but do not feel able to be as upfront about their beliefs in the community because of fear for their own jobs or what have you. And they say, "How can I get a congregation like yours?" You know, and I think it's really a tribute to the open-mindedness, their willingness to be challenged, and also I think the relationship I've established with them over the years, that we're willing to go to these very difficult places together and not drag one another along, but try to bring one another along regardless of where we personally see ourselves standing on the issue. About a year and a half ago, I took 20 members of my congregation, and one of them is here, Ray Grossman, to the West Bank because I realized that this shouldn't just be my own personal journey. If I'm going to be going on this journey as a rabbi, I need to share it with those who are literally willing to go with me on that journey. And so we went on a trip that only spent time on the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Most Jewish community trips to Israel are fairly hermetically sealed trips that stay on the other side of the Green Line and experience only one half of the reality. And it was definitely one of the most rewarding experiences of my life as a rabbi, of bringing 20 congregants who didn't all have the same assumptions about what was going on, but were willing to go together to these places. We stayed in refugee camps. We met with Palestinian nonviolent activists. We went to very, very disturbing places like Hebron, where there really is literally racial separation, separate roads, separate sidewalks in parts of the city. We saw some very disturbing, troubling things together, and their bravery and their willingness to go on this journey with me has meant a great deal to me. So I will say, okay, I want to leave as much time as I can for conversation, so I'll try to end around 10 after or quarter after. I've been a rabbi since 1992, and I'm originally from Los Angeles. I grew up in a very Jewishly identified family, grew up in a Reform temple, and Israel has been really a central part of my own Jewish identity for my entire life, as it is for many, many Jews. You often hear that the Israel-Palestine conflict is really a political conflict and not a religious one per se, and I think that's true. That is true. At the same time, though, I think you could say that Zionism is the civil religion of American Jewry. It occupies a very, very central place. Identification with the country, and identification with the mythic story of the creation of the Zionist movements and the building of a Jewish nation in Israel, in the Jewish people's mythic homeland of the land of Israel. That story has near sacred status among Jews. I'm sure you can't help but notice that just about every synagogue in Chicago has a sign in front of it, right, that says "We stand with Israel," an American flag, an Israeli flag. On every bima, we don't have that sign, but every other synagogue does. On every bima, you know, where the focal point of the service takes place, there is the ark, and on either side of the ark, almost at every synagogue throughout the country, you'll see an American flag and an Israeli flag. Where this is the direction where people literally pray toward the sacred Torah and two national symbols. So in all kinds of ways, consciously and unconsciously, Israel has been, I believe, the civil religion, as I like to call it, of American Jewry. And it certainly was for me. I first visited Israel when I was very young. I have family there and many, many friends. I visited more times than I can count. When I rediscovered my own Judaism when I was in college at UCLA, Israel was probably the defining aspect of it. And that mythic story of the creation of a Jewish homeland where this new Jewish culture in the wake of this horrible traumatic experience of the Holocaust had occurred. It's a redemptive story, and it spoke very deeply to me and very powerfully to me. And I ended up taking time off from college. I spent 2 years in Israel, most of them living on a kibbutz, and I very seriously considered moving there. And I identified in particular with a brand of Judaism called labor Zionism and what I would call today liberal Zionism. I ended up not moving to kibbutz and picking tomatoes for the rest of my life, which was a good decision, I think. Most of my friends who did have since left the country. I have a few friends who still remain there. But in the meantime, I for all kinds of complicated reasons I won't go into, I ended up deciding to become a rabbi. But I always identified very, very strongly with Israel and with Zionism. I used to refer to Zionism and Israel as sort of the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And I never really, even though there were little voices in the back of my head sort of challenging that vision, that this was a national liberation movement that came at the expense of another people, namely the people who actually lived in that land when we came over. There were always these nagging little voices in the back of my mind that challenged my liberal Zionism. And probably the most important voice I realize now was the one that said, I could never sort of, as an American who lives in a civil democracy where we have a pluralistic country, a pluralistic nation and ethics, square that with Zionism, which was a movement that was formed to create a nation that was predicated on the identity, the ethnic religious identity of one specific people in a land that has always been historically multi-ethnic and multi-religious. And as a liberal Zionist, we would talk about the solution to this problem would be a two-state solution, right? That we could have an ethnic Jewish nation and a Palestinian nation. And once we had that would solve all the problems. But still, I would hear these voices. We would talk a lot about, and you still hear this, liberal Zionists talk about the importance of a two-state solution because there's a demographic threat. I'm sure many of you have heard this argument, that the birth rate, the Arab-Palestinian birth rate in that entire land is growing very quickly. And that in order to have a Jewish nation, it needs to have a majority of Jews in it. And so the concept of Zionism is predicated on an ethnic Jewish majority. And, I never knew what to do with that voice. If we talked about in this country, if someone talked to you in this country about a demographic threat to the integrity of the American nature of this country, we would find that to be very extreme. We'd find that to be racist. But yet, in Israel, the integrity of the Jewish character of that country, we hear that an awful lot, the Jewish character of the country is so very important, is predicated on a demographic majority. And that was always a very, very difficult voice for me to deal with. So I sort of put it in a lockbox and kept it in the back of my mind. There are other voices related to that, the circumstances of Israel's founding, that we've increasingly come to realize that it was, the myth of a nation without a land without a people for a people without a land isn't simply not correct. And many Israeli historians have since debunked that mythic story, that the nation was created through the displacement, in many cases, the forced displacement of Palestinians and the destruction of their villages and the creation of a huge refugee population. And the part of me that cherishes human rights and democracy, etc., never knew quite what to do. When I read those historians when they were first translated into English in the 90s, for many people, many of us, many liberal Zionists in particular, were very challenged by that. But again, put it in the lockbox in the back of my mind. And I really would answer these kinds of things usually with a recurring mantra, which was, and in particular, liberal Jews and liberal Zionists love this mantra. We say, it's complicated. Well, it's complicated. And little by little, I can now chart how my resolve on this issue began to get, my resolve began to get chipped away at. I think, looking back, the war in Lebanon in '82, which occurred when I was in college, was just the military ferocity of that campaign, and the Sabra and Shatila massacres, I'm sure which many of you have heard about, it was the first time that many people refer to it as Israel's Vietnam, that the mythic vision of Israel's military of being this fine, upstanding, most moral army in the world began to be compromised. And then little by little, the First Intifada, the Second Intifada, the next campaign in Lebanon in 2006, the Blockade of Gaza, all of these things really began to push me. But my response to them as a rabbi, because when I became a rabbi, my own views on Israel, it was more than just my own views, right? As a rabbi, as a public figure, people expected me to talk about these things. I remember the breakout of the Second Intifada occurred during Yom Kippur, during Rosh Hashanah, literally, Erev Rosh Hashanah, the eve of Rosh Hashanah, was when the Second Intifada broke out in 2000. And I just didn't even mention Israel. It was horrible. I was reading these accounts, and I dealt with it like many rabbis did, through avoidance, which is not to talk about it, or if I did, just to deal with it in sort of platitudes. We call for peace on all sides. We encourage people to come back to the table. The only answer is a mutually negotiated two-state solution, and that was about the extent of my sharing my opinions of what was going on, because the anguish, I think, looking back, went so deep that the idea of sharing it made me feel very, very vulnerable. And for me, the breaking point where I finally decided I couldn't stay silent on my anguish anymore was what's known as Operation Cast Lead, which began in December 2008, January 2009. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what occurred. There had been a blockade on Gaza since the election of Hamas to the government in Gaza. Israel had since withdrawn, but basically blockaded the country on land, by sea, and by air. And there was resistance to this on the part of Hamas and other Palestinian groups in Gaza by sending Qassam rockets into Israel. And Israel decided to retaliate, or retaliate is probably not the best word. Israel decided to deal with the situation by going in with a massive military onslaught that ended up killing well over 1,000 people, many of them civilians, and injuring scores of people. And when I read about the initial attack, which I'll talk about in a moment, I just sort of, all the resistance just sort of ended. You know, the voices in the lockbox, I just let them run free. I had, and how that was manifest was that as was mentioned in the introduction, I write a blog. And I had been writing a blog since 2006. It's called Shalom Rav. And when I first started writing a blog, it was really just a way to get, you know, my thoughts in my head out to my congregation and anyone else who was interested in reading them. The early days of my blog, I would just, anything that was in my head, I just write about it. And this was well before the days that grown-ups started using Facebook. So I found a funny YouTube video, I'd put it on my blog, anything and everything. But I also wrote a great deal about social justice issues, because that's always been very important to me. And so it was really, it had become a wonderful venue for me just to think out loud and to engage in conversation with people on things, issues, and areas that were important to me. And so in December of 2008, when I read about the first reports coming out of Gaza, I just, as I said before, it was an important turning point in me in terms of my own feeling about what was really going on and what I needed to do as a rabbi. And what was really going on to me became very clear, that this was oppression, that Israelis were in Gaza at that moment, but had been, up until that point, oppressing Palestinians. And that's different than saying, well, there's violence on both sides. It's looking at it as a balanced situation. That it's a complicated situation, but there's violence on both sides, which is all true. But really, I really allowed myself to accept that this was a situation in which one infinitely more powerful side was seeking to create a Jewish state militarily, and the only way they could do that was to crush those who were not part of that vision. And yes, it was complicated, right? Everything is complicated, but underneath I think too often we use the complications as a convenient dodge to face some very actual, straightforward truths. I think we all know that geopolitical issues are complicated, but we also know oppression when we see it. And for me, at least, that was what was going on. And so I sat down and I just wrote a blog post where I put this all out for people. And so I'll read to you that post. And it is dated December 28th, 2008, and it's entitled, "Outrage in Gaza, No More Apologies." The news today out of Israel and Gaza makes me just sick to my stomach. I know I can already hear the responses. Every nation has a responsibility to ensure the safety of its citizens. If the Qassam stop, Israel wouldn't be forced to take military action. Hamas also bears responsibility for this tragic situation. I could answer each and every one of these claims in turn, but I'm ready to stop this perverse game of rhetorical ping pong. I don't buy the rationalizations anymore. I'm so tired of the apologetics. How on earth will squeezing the life out of Gaza, not to mention bombing the living hell out of it, ensure the safety of Israeli citizens? We good liberal Jews are ready to protest oppression and human rights abuse anywhere in the world, but are all too willing to give Israel a pass. It's a fascinating double standard, and one I understand all too well. I understand it because I've been just as responsible as anyone else for perpetrating it. So no more rationalizations. What Israel has been doing to the people of Gaza is an outrage. It has brought nothing but safety, and it has brought neither safety nor security to the people of Israel, and it has wrought nothing but misery and tragedy upon the people of Gaza. There, I said it. Now what do I do? And that last question was sort of misunderstood at the time. I think a lot of people thought it was sort of this practical question, like, well, what do I do now? And so people wrote in, oh, well, you should write letters and you should march in rallies and then join this movement. And really that wasn't what I was asking. It was a much deeper, more existential kind of question, which was, well, I've crossed this line now, and what do I do now? It was more like, where do I fit? Who am I? I wasn't sure if I could be Jewish in the same way. I wasn't sure if I had a job in my congregation, possibly. It was a statement of vulnerability of I'm not really sure where I stand anymore. And I've since received the answer to that question. And the book is really sort of over a 2-year period of exploring the answers to that question and people engaging in conversation with me. But what happened after I wrote that was it went viral, and things just sort of went crazy. I got more comments to that blog post than I'd ever gotten before, or since. There were close to 200 comments of all kinds, but most of them were by Jews saying, "Thank you, Rabbi, for saying this. Thank you for, saying what I've been wanting to say for a long time but haven't been able to do." But also there were people who were saying, wow, that's really interesting that a rabbi's saying this. Tell me more about what you mean by this. And there were people, angry comments saying, how dare you? Israel's under attack, and as a rabbi you should be standing with Israel, and how dare you be a traitor to your people. And it's sort of this wide variety of comments. And what was interesting is I responded to some of them, but they started responding to each other, and it began this interesting sort of conversation. But what for me happened was my coming out on this issue, as I describe it in the book, that caused the dominoes to fall. That this wasn't just about Gaza. This was about something much, and it wasn't just about the occupation in the West Bank. It really went back to 1948 when the state was founded, and even earlier than that in the founding of the Zionist movement, and just so many of the troubling questions that I had not allowed myself to entertain, I started to entertain publicly and to act on. I started another colleague of mine, Rabbi Brian Walt, and I started an ad hoc initiative called the Jewish Fast for Gaza. And we got 10 rabbis to put out a call that was calling for an end to the attacks and the end to the blockade and the beginning of real engagement. And with another rabbinic colleague, Alyssa Wise, we went on Yom Ha'atzmaut, which is Israel Independence Day. We started an initiative we called Rabbis Remembering the Nakba. Nakba is the Arabic word that Palestinians use for what occurred for them at the time of Israeli political independence, which is a catastrophe. It's the time of their displacement. And I publicly said that I can't celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut anymore unabashedly as a Jew, that this has become sort of the American Jewish communal focal point. And as a Jew, and knowing that this is the day of communal tragedy for the Palestinian people, how must it appear to them that this is a day for Jews worldwide celebrating? And my colleagues and I, thankfully I had other colleagues, kindred spirits, who were able to work on these projects together. We decided that this was more accurately a day for reflection and for soul searching and for even repentance. And so we brought Jews and Palestinians together in homes around the country, including my home here in Chicago and in Evanston, and learned about what was lost on the day that we celebrate. And we learned about the different Palestinian villages on that particular day that were destroyed. We heard testimonies from Palestinians who experienced the Nakba or heard these stories from their parents or grandparents. And this is the kind of journey I began to move on. And it turns out that, as I said before, my congregation, although it caused a fair amount of upheaval in my congregation, as my congregants will attest, we have found a way to talk about it together, to continue to have a congregation where a rabbi is, in his own activism, taking this public a stance, and yet trying to facilitate a conversation, a safe place to have a conversation within the congregation. I became very, very involved with the movement, as was mentioned in the introduction, Jewish Voice for Peace, which I consider to be one of the great, important, and fastest growing Jewish organizations in the country, that has a central part of its message, human rights and democracy and civil rights for all who live in the land, and helped found the Rabbinical Council. We now have 42 rabbis on our Rabbinical Council. I just got back from the Bay Area where we had our national members meeting, and the rabbis got together. And there are many, it includes rabbis and rabbinical students and cantors and there are an increasing number of young rabbinical students who are joining, for whom this community is a very important place because it feels like the Jewish community can be a place where they can be whole and speak their conscience on this issue, which they and I believe is the issue of our time as Jews, quite frankly. There are many, many important issues around the country and around the world, but the issue of justice in Israel-Palestine, I think, challenges us as Jews in so many important ways that I think we have to find a way to talk about it and to make room for the kinds of conversations we're having right here in this room. So what I want to do is just read two more blog posts just to give you an idea of sort of the trajectory of my evolution on this issue. The first is the year anniversary of Cast Lead, and where I'm sort of thinking back on the changes that I went through at that time a year later. And then I'm going to read the final post in the book, which is from 2010, which sort of, the arc is sort of complete at that point. So this one is entitled Gaza 1 Year Later Beyond the Complications, December 28th, 2009. It was exactly 1 year ago that I read the first news accounts of Israel's military assault on Gaza. Then I quote the New York Times article that I had read that caused me to write the post, and this is what it says. Waves of Israeli airstrikes destroyed Hamas security facilities in Gaza on Saturday in a crushing response to the group's rocket fire, killing more than 225, the highest one-day toll in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in decades. There was a shocking quality to Saturday's attacks, which began in broad daylight as police cadets were graduating. Women were shopping at the outdoor market, and children were emerging from school. The center of Gaza City was a scene of chaotic horror, with rubble everywhere, sirens wailing, and women shrieking as dozens of mutilated bodies were laid out on the pavement and in the lobby of Shifa Hospital so that family members could identify them. The dead included civilians, including several construction workers and at least 2 children in school uniforms. By afternoon, shops were shuttered, funerals began, and mourning tents were visible on nearly every major street of this densely populated city. End quote. Previously, when I'd hear this kind of news out of Israel-Palestine, my shock and anguish would quickly be tempered by a familiar voice telling me to calm down, don't overreact, don't forget how terribly complicated the situation is. Indeed, I distinctly recall hearing that voice 3 years earlier when the IDF responded to Hezbollah rocket attacks with a similarly massive military onslaught. This time, though, it was different. This time I didn't hear the voice. Somehow, it just didn't seem all that complicated to me anymore. Ideologically speaking, I've regarded Zionism with great pride as the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. Of course, I didn't deny that this rebirth had come at the expense of another people. Of course, I recognized that Israel's creation was bound up with the suffering of the Palestinians. The situation was, well, it was complicated. Last year, however, I reacted differently. I read of Apache helicopters dropping hundreds of tons of bombs on 1.5 million people crowded into a 140 square mile patch of land with nowhere to run. In the coming days, I would read about the bombing of schools, whole families being blown to bits, children literally burned to the bone with white phosphorus. Somehow, it didn't seem complicated at all anymore. At long last, I felt as though I were viewing the conflict with something approaching clarity. Of course, I think we'd all agree that the Israel-Palestine conflict is technically complicated, but at the end of the day, there is nothing complicated about persecution. The political situation in Darfur, for instance, is enormously complicated, but these complications certainly haven't stopped scores of Jews across North America from protesting the human rights injustices being committed there. We do so because we know that underneath all the geopolitical complexities, oppression is oppression. And as Jews, we know instinctively that our sacred tradition and our own tragic history require us to speak out against all oppression committed in our midst. I'd suggest that if there is anything complicated for us here, it is in the possibility that we might, in fact, have become oppressors ourselves. That is painfully complicated. After all, our Jewish identity has been bound up with the memory of our own persecution for centuries. How on earth can we comprehend, let alone respond to, the suggestion that we've become our own worst nightmare? More than anything else, what I was trying to say in that anguished, emotional blog post 1 year ago was, is this what it has come to? have we come to the point where Israel can wipe out hundreds of people, whole families, whole neighborhoods, and our response as Jews will simply be to rationalize it away? At the very least, will we be able to stop and question what has brought us to this terrifying point? Have we become unable to recognize persecution for what it really and truly is? Those who know me or read my blog surely know that it has been a painfully challenging year for me. My own relationship to Israel is changing in ways I could never have predicted. Since I started raising questions like those above, I've lost some friends, and yes, my congregation has lost some members. But if Zionism is the unofficial religion of the contemporary Jewish community, I'm sure there are many who consider me to be something of an apostate. But at the same time, I've been surprised and encouraged by the large number of people who I've met who have been able to engage with these questions openly and honestly, even if they don't always agree with me. I suppose this is what I decided to do 1 year ago, to put my faith in our ability to stand down the paralyzing complexities, however painful the prospect. 1 year later, I still hold tight to this faith. And then I'll end with my final post in here, which is entitled "A Jew in Solidarity with the Palestinian People," November 29th, 2010. I should say I should mention the book came about because, I was doing all this writing and there was all these amazing blog comments. Many of them were incredibly eloquent and long, and people were having an amazing conversation with one another. And it was unusual for blogs, actually. If you read blogs, you know that comments on blogs can often be pretty low common denominator. There are people who spend their lives trolling blogs and just spewing really nasty stuff. And I've always been very proud of my blog, that I think largely because so many of the commenters are my congregants who don't typically read or comment on blogs. It's always just been very eloquent. And it occurred to me that there could be an interesting book in there somewhere over this 2-year period in particular. And so I read one of the blogs actually that I follow. I'm a blog fanatic. I read lots of blogs. And there was a blog called Gaza Mom that I highly recommend by Layla El-Haddad, who is a Gaza mom who wrote from within about her experiences as a Palestinian and as a Gazan. And her book, she did an anthology of blog posts for a publishing company called Just World Books, which was founded, small independent publisher. It was founded by Helena Cabin, who is a journalist and a blogger, and who's for years she was based in Lebanon back in the 80s. And I called her up. I just sort of called her, sent her an email after reading Layla's book and saying, I see you publish, books into blogs, or blogs into books rather, and I think I might have a, possibility here. And she was very encouraging. She goes, I read your blog. I would love to. She was from the very beginning very encouraging. And so what I did, I worked with an editor to do this, was teased out a lot of the stuff that just got buried over the years, including posts and comments, and put them together in a way that, for people especially who don't read blogs, could read and sort of see how the narrative continued over this 2-year period. And I ended it with this post, which I think in many ways is the answer to the first question that I asked in that original blog post of what do I do now? It's entitled "A Jew in Solidarity with the Palestinian People," and it's dated November 29th, 2010. As today marks the UN International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People, I'd like to take occasion of this day to publicly state without hesitation that I stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people. As a Jew, I will also say without hesitation that I reject the view that I must choose between standing with Jews or standing with Palestinians. This is a zero-sum outlook that only serves to promote division, enmity, and fear. For me, the bottom line is this: the cornerstone value of my religious tradition commands me to stand in solidarity with all who are oppressed. It would thus be a profound betrayal of my own Jewish heritage if I consciously chose not to stand with the Palestinian people. In other words, I believe my Jewish liberation to be intrinsically bound up with Palestinian liberation. It's really that simple. But of course, there is nothing simple about it. To take such a step is deeply painful in many ways. It means, among other things, facing down my people's own potential for oppression, to admit that the state of Israel, born in the wake of persecution, has itself become a persecutor. However, I must also admit that this pain, uncomfortable though it is nothing compared to the pain being experienced by the Palestinian people on a daily basis. Any person of privilege who stands in solidarity with the oppressed would do well to bear this in mind. While we must explore our own guilt and culpability, we must also bear in mind that it is not ultimately about us. And then I quote a section on what solidarity means, but I'll end with the final paragraph. And so today, I'll take this opportunity to say I stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people, but I'm not saying so to assuage my Jewish pain and guilt, nor to claim that I personally know how this liberation must eventually be achieved. In the end, I stand here because I know in my heart it is where I must be. And with that, I will open up for questions. I realize that, thank you. I realize that many of the things I've said may be very challenging or painful, and I want you to know I offer them in the spirit of dialogue and in the spirit of my own testimony, my own story, and sharing that with you. And I think often the most important conversations are the most painful ones, and so I look forward to being able to have a real and honest dialogue with all of you here today.